Hello biology class. Right, in this video we're going to be proceeding further into module 14B. We're looking at pages 441 to 449 and we'll be covering on your own 14.8 through 14.16. So let's take a look at deciduous plants. These are plants that lose their leaves in the winter. Of course, quite familiar to us living in the northeast region of the U.S. Many of our trees around here lose their leaves in the winter. And this happens through what's called the abscission layer, which is this thin layer of tissue that blocks the xylem and phloem tissue from running through to the petiole of the leaf during the fall. And that initiates the severing of the leaf from the stem, and is activated during the fall when the hours of sunlight decrease. And then what happens is once this abscission layer starts blocking the xylem and the phloem, the chlorophyll, the chloroplasts begin to fade off in these leaves, and then anthocyanins that are present, which these are these pigments that can arise in various colors depending on the pH of the leaf. These become more vibrant, more obvious in the leaf because the chlorophyll is dying off, and then these other pigments emerge and are more visible. Another possibility is that there's tannic acid present in some leaves, and this is just a type of pigment that produces a brown color in the leaf, and as you may know, it's found in tea. So let's look at question on your own 14.8. The question is, there are a few leaves, such as the floating leaves of a water lily plant, in which the stomata and the spongy mesophyll are on the top side of the leaf, while the palisade mesophyll is on the bottom. In these leaves, which side will have the darker green color? So typically in a leaf, the darker green color is on the top, but in the water lily, as they mentioned, the type of tissue is sort of upside down, or it's in the opposite orientation you'd find. So the lighter color is actually on the top here, and the darker color shows the underleaf of the water lily on the underside, so that way you can see how that's actually darker than the top. Okay, 14.9. If a leaf isn't green, does that mean there is no chlorophyll in it? Well, as we just described before, it certainly means that there's other pigments that are showing, and there could be some chlorophyll in it, but these other pigments are dominating the what's visible in the leaf. So the answer is no, that there could be chlorophyll, but it could be just being masked by other pigments. 14.10. If a green leaf has no abscission layer, what color will the leaf be in the winter? Well, in this case, it would continue to stay green, hence our evergreens, which we're also very fortunate to have in this area. All right, now let's look at roots. Roots are typically found below the ground, although there are some exceptions. And there's three main functions of roots. They have to absorb water, help to anchor the plant, and store food. So root systems can be categorized in two different ways. You can have a fibrous root system or a tap root systems. And the book makes a point to say that all root systems are usually bigger than the plant that is above ground. So whatever plant you see that's visible above the ground is usually in some way smaller actually than the root system that's supporting it. So fibrous roots have many branches, which would be the case for this tree. Those roots branch off in many directions, whereas a taproot, the primary root, this sort of singular root for the plant, is the main root. And so in this figure on 14.10, we can see 4 main regions in a cross section of a root. So it's like if the root's pointing down this way, it's been like cut in half, and then we're looking closely at the tissue on like a cross section of that tissue. So the 4 sections we see here are, I guess, going from the bottom to the top is the root cap, the meristematic region, elongation region, and the maturation region. So the root cap is at the bottom. It's sort of dead, thick-walled cells that are pushing down into the soil. The meristematic region is undifferentiated cells that are dividing, so a lot of mitosis is going along here. Then you can see in this is stained, this purple into the yellow, the transition from the meristematic tissue into this elongation region where the cells are differentiated more specifically into different types of cells. And then here in this region up here, they have the fully matured cells in the maturation region. Then we also have these few root hairs that are pointed out along the side. It helps increase the surface area of the root for absorbing water and other minerals from the soil. Now, in this cross section of a root, it's sort of the opposite orientation. It's cutting the root this way and then looking like a bird's eye view into that cross section. This is figure 1411 in your book, and we will be looking at a dicot root here. We'll be talking in more detail about what a dicot is, and we'll just point out some of the labels on here. So we have the epidermis is on the outside here, and this is considered dermal tissue. Then we have the cortex is the cell layer inside the epidermis, and this is ground tissue that stores nutrients. Then we have the endodermis, which is labeled here on this slide, and it's one cell thick layer that's inside the root, and it offers support. It's another type of ground tissue, and that is here. Then you have the vascular chamber, right, which is basically this whole region here that surrounds the xylem and the phloem cells. And the vascular cambium is this region in between the xylem and the phloem cells. And the pericycle is one specialized form of the vascular cambium, which can develop into a new branch of the root if need be. All right, so let's look at On Your Own 1411. It says a 12-foot high plant has a root system that travels to a soil depth of only 3 feet. Does this plant have a taproot system or a fibrous root system? Well, if the plant is 12 feet high and it has a root system that is as shallow as 3 feet, then it would clearly be a fibrous root system. Okay, On Your Own 412, page 446, it says classify each tissue labeled in figure 1411 as ground tissue, dermal, meristematic, or vascular tissue. So we'll start with the epidermis. This is dermal tissue on the outside. Then you have cortex, which is ground tissue. It stores nutrients. That's labeled here. Then the endodermis, as we mentioned, is here. It supports the xylem and the phloem, so that's also considered ground tissue. The pericycle is over here. That's meristematic tissue. It's undifferentiated. And the xylem and the phloem is the vascular tissue. That's labeled here. And that's the xylem is transporting water, and the phloem is transporting food or other nutrients. Okay, on your own 1413, if a root contains little cortex tissue compared to similar roots, what function can you conclude the root does not perform? And in this case, they're referring to the cortex, if it's not there, that the root would not be able to store substances, because the cortex is where storage would occur. All right, let's move on to stems. So we have three main functions of stems. One, that they support and manufacture leaves. They conduct water and nutrients to and from the leaves. And they have a minor role in photosynthesis, sometimes only when they're young. But nonetheless, there is a part of the stem that may be carrying on photosynthesis. So stems can be found in various forms. They can be upright, like in trees and flowers, climbing, like in vines, prostrate, like in watermelons and cucumbers that grow along the ground, and then finally, and interestingly, subterranean, like in potatoes, and we'll be talking about potatoes in a little more detail in a few minutes. All right, so plants are classified. Another way of classifying plants is whether they're monocots or dicots. So we're going to look at some comparing and contrasting of monocots and dicots. So I'm sure you remember, right, mono, that prefix means one, and di means two. And the cot in this is referring to a cotyledon, which is in the initial stage of the seed. It has a seed leaf that's referred to as a cotyledon. So a monocot has one cotyledon, and a dicot has two. And so we are going to compare them a little bit. So in a monocot, you would find parallel venation. So you think of a corn plant. Here is a good picture of the corn leaf. Here's another one. It has parallel veins, versus a dicot, which would have netted veins in its leaves. Then secondly, the root of a monocot has pith, whereas the dicot does not. The monocot has vascular bundles, which you can see on here. Throughout, well, I should say they both have some vascular bundles, but the monocot has them throughout the stem, so the pattern is throughout the stem, whereas the dicot has it in a different type of arrangement. And monocots, interestingly, have flower parts in threes, so you see the three petals here, whereas the dicots are in fours or fives, petals in those, in that pattern. All right, so let's look at herbaceous stems in monocots and dicots. So they have some similarities. They both have an epidermis that protects the stem. They both have fibrobascular bundles that have xylem and phloem, and they both have a cortex in the stems which contains photosynthetic cells and stores starch. But there's some differences. In a monocot, the cortex is found throughout the stem, and I'm looking here so you can see. Here is the monocot, here's the cortex that's throughout the stem. In the dicot, however, the cortex is found in a ring structure in the outer part of the stem. And then in dicots, you have the vascular cambium that can form new xylem or phloem cells. So let's look at woody stems in dicots. So the bark on woody stems, which obviously is in this case going to be the cross section. We're on figure 14.3. The cross section showing the bark on the outside, the perimeter of that. So it has two layers. It has the inner bark that is labeled along here. It has the xylem and the phloem cells, and the outer bark is on the very outside, and they're separated by this layer called a cork cambium that produces cork cells. They form the outer bark and they help protect the stem. And the book describes how bark is unique to woody stems, and it allows them to continue to grow each year. And the reason that it's cracked and rough is because the trunk is basically growing and swelling from within. And as it does so each year, the bark becomes cracked and rough. The bark makes mention of the white birch tree, which has an unusually smooth texture for its bark. And also this vascular cambium here is an area that produces new xylem and phloem cells. Now what's interesting about these woody dicot stems, right, are that the xylem here are large in the spring and smaller in the summer. And when they die, they form the wood of the tree. So that's this area here. And the change in the color of the xylem alternates light and dark. As you can see, they form these rings around here, which we consider growth rings. And the width of the ring shows how much growth occurred in each year. So if you have a large span, a wide span here, it would show a robust growth in that year. And if it was a small ring, it would be a small, a year that wasn't as productive. All right, so we have another visitor for our video here, checking out our woody dicot stems. All right, and then finally, we also see that the phloem are near the outside of the stems. Grab my pencil. So you can see the phloem here. That is more on the perimeter, the outside of the stem. And so because of that, the position of those phloem cells, you can perform what's called girdling on a tree. And that's where if you cut or strip the tree totally around its circumference and take all the phloem off, you can kill the tree that way. And that would help people, I guess, who are trying to harvest wood to help the tree die and make it easier to cut down. All right, we're going to look at some specialized stems, which are quite interesting. So most of us would think as bulbs, right, as roots, but they actually, a bulb like an onion is actually a specialized stem. The bulb itself is like a collection of leaves, but they don't perform photosynthesis. And then we have potatoes, as I mentioned earlier, actually another type of specialized stem called a tuber, which stores starch. And so you can see this diagram of a potato plant. The actual roots are sort of this fibrous system here, but these tubers are considered underground stems. And then obviously it has a portion of the plant that lives above ground as well. All right, let's look at on your own 14. It says, if a stem has no cork, is it woody or herbaceous? Well, the answer to that would be that it's herbaceous. because all woody stems have cork. And the next one, if a stem has no limits to its growth, is it woody or herbaceous? Well, if you think of the redwood trees right out in California, they have no limit to their growth, and clearly they're woody. The structure of the woody trunk allows it to, to grow bigger and bigger because it has that firm structure that is not limiting like the herbaceous stems would, because they're softer. Okay, 1416. A stem has xylem and phloem packed together in fibrovascular bundles scattered throughout the stem. Is it woody or herbaceous? Well, we know in this case it would be herbaceous because they're actually scattered throughout the whole stem, like in this pattern here. I know this is only a quarter of the whole stem, but those bundles are throughout the whole stem, whereas the dicots would represent the woody are in a certain pattern that are just on the perimeter. All right, so that wraps it up for this section, and then we'll be putting together one more video on the final section of Module 14.